first question is from Ishmael. And they say, does one need to use different synthesis approaches in such situations where few data can be used in a meta-analysis to make any reasonable conclusion? And does combining these approaches induce effects from multiple testing? And how can one take care of that problem?
Does one need to use difference in such where there's few data can be used in a meta-analysis? I mean, in some ways, I think, this is about, so what's happening in a lot of reviews is when there's two things that tend to happen. There's a set of studies that just disappear and never contribute anything. Or there's a situation where people make statements like they'll make statements that there were there were mixed effects observed. And so what's happening in that second situation is people are synthesizing in some way, but they're not explicit in how they're doing it. What we're trying to encourage people to do is, regardless of whether you've got 2 studies, 300 studies, be explicit in what you do. So if you're not prepared to meta-analyze, but you are going to vote count, you need to say that you are vote counting. So when you say mixed, you are vote counting, but you're not being clear often to say how you are doing that vote count. So there's that particular situation. And I think, that's something that could be improved in all reviews and applies probably in most reviews. And then there's this situation where you've got a meta-analysis, you have these other studies. Sometimes you might only have a fraction of the studies available. And they just kind of disappear off the review. So what we're trying to do is to say, well, what information can we garner from those other studies to either supplement the meta-analysis to help us think, how could those studies where we've not got that information, can we look at any of the information that's there to help us think whether those studies might potentially alter the conclusion of that meta-analysis. I guess I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but it's some answer to some question. Sue's put her camera on, so I think she might want to talk, particularly there's a question around grade there. Sue heads up the Melbourne Grade Centre, so I might have something to say on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. I mean, if you're happy for me to do that, I'd be happy to take on Ruth and Eugenie's question. And I might start with Eugenie's question first. So this is a conversation Jo and I were having immediately prior. We've had lots of conversations about how do we move from the synthesis we do when we use these other methods through to grading the results of their syntheses. And I think that's a challenge that grade is yet to tackle, to be honest. So Eugenie, you've referred to Hassam Murad's paper, which of course provides some guidance on where we don't have a single pooled estimate. Here we've got a slightly more complex situation than that, in that we might have a pooled estimate plus a result from another synthesis or some combination of different synthesis methods. So the first thing to say is we don't have an answer to how to grade. The second thing to say is the work that Jo's presented is the synthesis bit. It's not the next step, which is assessing the certainty of the evidence from that synthesis. And I think the third thing to say, like you, I had a bit of a moment when I read strong evidence of an effect. It gets tied up with grade language, and I think we have a challenge there because from that particular synthesis method, that is the terminology we would use, we have got evidence of an effect. If you're familiar with the grade approach, we have what we call a minimally contextualised approach. And within that, what we can do is interpret our result as in relation to the null, which answers the question of do we have evidence of an effect, or we can interpret our result in relation to another threshold, a threshold for an important difference, for example, so an MID or something like that. That would be an additional step. You would have to say, how are you going to interpret these results? Are you just looking for evidence of an effect, or are you looking for evidence of an important effect? And that would then feed into your grade assessment. So it would be a separate kind of consideration. And just quickly, in terms of the summary of findings table, again, Ruth, we don't have the answer to that either. I certainly would be inclined to present the meta-analytic result using the structured format that GRADE has, so that we can present both relative and absolute effects. But in the comments column, I would actually bring in that result from the p-value synthesis, but that's an off-the-cuff kind of response. So I'll hand back to Jo to answer the next question.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Okay, so from Ismail, I think the question is, how does this contrast with previous guidance against vote counting? Actually, the advice that you can vote count based on the direction of effect has been in the Cochrane Handbook for a very long time, in what was chapter 9 in the previous version, I think. So the problem with vote counting gets a bad rap, and reasonably so, because most vote counting that occurs is based on, in some way, on statistical significance, or sometimes kind of subjective rules. So people will do things like say, if the effect is 10% or more, so if I can't work out the statistical significance, but the effect is 10% or more, or some criteria, then I'll count that as favouring the intervention, for example. And so there are all these kind of rules that people have invented to try and kind of, work out whether the intervention is having some effect. Now, as I said, they are, as soon as you incorporate statistical significance, it's really problematic, because, if you think about meta-analysis, often the whole ideal of meta-analysis is that we can bring together a set of small studies that each study could not estimate the effect accurately, but when we bring those studies together, we can estimate the effect accurately. So that was always the kind of benefit that was purported around meta-analysis. But if you vote count based on statistical significance, if all your studies, for example, only had 10% power to detect an underlying intervention effect, then you're always going to end up at the end of that vote count saying there was no effect. So vote counting with statistical significance is really problematic. You will always kind of bias towards the intervention not being effective if you've got small studies and small underlying intervention effects. So that's the problem with vote counting. You vote count just based on the direction of effect, you remove that issue. And that's why we can use the approach. But it is, it's not a very powerful approach. So it's not like when you do a meta-analysis where you've got much more power than you have if you vote count based on the direction of effect. But having said all of that, again, in some ways, this is, it's about, considering acceptable synthesis methods. We're not, ideally, we would want to always fit a meta-analysis and prediction intervals and meta-regressions to be able to investigate effects. But often we can't do that. And so we have to kind of then step back and say, well, how can I kind of transparently and accurately reflect the data at hand? And so I guess that's the place that we're trying to get to here.